Hello, everyone. On behalf of Father Charles and everyone at the Catholic Information Center, welcome here. We are so glad that you're with us tonight to welcome Padre. Padre Cantillon Murphy obtained his undergraduate degree in electrical and electronic engineering. It would help to turn the microphone on, wouldn't it? There we go. So he obtained his degree at the University of College Cork before completing graduate and doctoral degrees at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He subsequently completed his postdoctoral research through concurrent appointments at Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Research Laboratory of Electronics at MIT. Professor Cantillon Murphy met his wife Grace while a graduate student at MIT. They returned to Ireland to raise their family in 2010, and dissatisfied with the state of Irish education, Grace began homeschooling their 8 children. When their oldest was in need, they, along with a number of other parents, at the approval of their local bishop, established a new private classical Catholic academy in 2020. As an extension of his commitment to classical education, Grace has also developed a comprehensive homeschool program, Mater Dei Education. Join me as we welcome Padre.
So, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this is of interest because please don't take it personally. I don't really want to be here. I'd much rather be there. So we've been blessed with 8 children, as Mary said. And this is a picture, by the way, of us at Knock. Knock is the National Marian Shrine in Ireland, and the school, incidentally, is dedicated to Our Lady of Knock and is placed under her protection. So, we're, I suppose, a little bit, we actually met as a couple, not at MIT at all. We met in a field outside Cologne in 2005. We were there for the World Youth Day in Cologne with Pope Benedict. And 2 years later, we were walking down the aisle in Grace's home parish in Paris. Grace grew up in France. And I guess God, like all of us, has us on a journey. And on that journey, I certainly didn't imagine ever having 8 children, and I didn't imagine being 0.3 of a mile from the White House talking about those 8 children and how we've gone about educating them. So please forgive my nervousness, but this is not, I teach every day at a podium, but I don't talk about subjects that are much closer to my heart, perhaps, than the engineering that I teach. There's another Catholic family, different era. I don't know if anybody has read the book or seen the movie. Very good. So 1 or 2 hands going up. If you haven't, don't, okay? And I mean that in a sense that it captured a moment, right, in Irish history, but specifically in the history of the church. The movie was released in 2000. It tells the tale of Frank McCourt's childhood in Limerick in the 1930s. But its negativity, I suppose, is the nicest way to put it, captured the essence of the decades before and after the movie was released in the 1990s into the 2000s, which were very, very challenging times for the church everywhere, but particularly in Ireland. The sexual abuse scandals, and the widespread lack of trust in the church in Ireland. And I'll come back to that because it had a profound impact on Catholic education in Ireland and beyond. But the interesting thing was the movie came to our school, and they shot scenes in this nondescript, depressing-looking building where I went to school on the north side of Cork City. And that in itself is a story, because 5 years after I graduated, the school closed after providing education to young boys in Cork for over 120 years. And in a picture, it captured that moment in time where really, if you wanted to put your finger on it, hope seemed to have disappeared from the Irish church, and particularly Catholic education. It was a very difficult time. It was a dark time in many dioceses, and one that, the societal changes that followed that period were, I think, looking back in 100 years, when people are hopefully rational again, the changes that happened in Ireland were at such a pace that sociologists and historians will look back and say, how did society actually enact that level of change so quickly? This is the latest, by the way, legislative proposal that we're actually going to probably see this enacted in law before the end of the calendar year. And this has all sorts of implications, as you can imagine, for Catholic education. And in a sense, there's a great fear that it is essentially a muzzle on any sort of open conversation and discussion about things like gender theory and so forth. But this is not where we came from. So we have been, in a sense, in the Dark Ages before. We're simply back there again. But the good news is that the last time there was a Dark Ages in Europe, there were a few Irish monks who were busily beavering away, manuscript copying, and not just these beautiful books. This one was discovered, this is the most recent discovery from a bog in County Tipperary. It's the 150 Psalms. If you go to Dublin, we brought the school, the teachers brought the school to Dublin recently to see this, amongst other things, because it's been recently unveiled for the first time to the public. It's the Fadán Mór Psalter. The extraordinary thing about this Psalter is that inside the cover was a sheet of papyrus from Egypt. Nobody knows how it got there. Nobody knows why it was there. The reality is that the Irish Church, far from being an insular island church back in the 7th and 8th century, was intricately connected with not just Europe, but the entire church across Europe and into the Near East. There were extraordinary levels of connections, and going into the 6th, 7th, 8th century, we find the giants of Irish monasticism, Columbanus being foremost amongst them, who left a trail of monasteries across Europe. Now, my personal opinion is that Cahill has exaggerated slightly in his book, but not a lot. We probably saved half of civilization with what the Irish monks achieved. It was extraordinary by any standards that a small nation not just saved the religious texts from obliteration, but saved many of the secular texts. The Irish monks were quite comfortable copying Virgil and Horace and Homer. And when you go, we'll come to the hedge schools later, but this classical education, in a sense, was born from these monastic schools, which the Irish set up all over Europe, copying what they had already been doing for a number of centuries in Ireland. That monastic organization, if you like, gave way to a diocesan structure that we're all very familiar with. And foremost in that period of renewal would have been Saint Malachy, who was responsible to a large extent for the influx of new religious congregations, many of whom taught in subsequent generations, the Dominicans, the Cistercians, the Franciscans, and so forth, which would have come into Ireland in the 9th, 10th, 11th century after that. This is a very, very quick run through Catholic education history in Ireland, but we have to understand that there were profound implications for the persecution that followed, going forward right to this day. So This is middle of the 17th century. In reality, the suppression of Catholic education began much earlier under the Elizabethan plantations, but really people encapsulate that period in the persona of Cromwell, and the persecution to hell or to Connacht was his mantra. And apart from being um, a point in time where bishops were hung, priests were expelled, Catholics were not allowed to be educated in any shape or form. And that had profound implications. For almost 100 years, people could not be educated if you were Catholic in the country. You could not learn to read and you could not learn to write, not at least legally. It had profound implications. This, by the way, is Carrigadrohid Castle. Bit of etymology for those of you who are interested in your Gaelic. So Carrig is a rock and Drohid is a bridge. So this is a rock that forms a bridge. The rock is the site of the castle. I mentioned this. This is about 10 minutes from where I live. And it is the site of the martyrdom of the Bishop of Cork, Bishop McGeegan, by Cromwell's troops, who had sacked Macroom. They killed 700 there. That's about 10 miles west of here. They came to Carrigadrohid Castle, which was a small garrison by Macroom standards, with Bishop McGeegan in tow, who had been captured, and told him to tell the garrison to surrender. He, of course, refused, being the good bishop that he was, and they hung him on a tree beside the castle. And this kind of historical context, I have to say, is not something I learned in my history books in school, because one of the first things you do when you want to strip culture out of a society is you stop teaching history to the children in school. So I learned all about Bishop McGeegan and Carrigadrohid Castle and Macroom Castle from my dad, from the teachers who went beyond what was in the classroom texts and actually told you the real story of what happened in the history books. And one also needs to put a little caveat on this. I went to school in the 80s in Ireland, which was a time of horrendous sectarian violence 300 miles north of where I lived. 3,000 people died as a consequence of many of the policies that had been enacted during this period. So there was a reason, one might say, why we were given a sanitized version of the history that our country had. But it had an implication on the wider picture of how history was being taught in schools, and that pointed to a greater reality, shall we say. I mention this also because the land, when it was confiscated, was given to a gentleman by the name of Admiral William Penn. Admiral William Penn's son is the founder of the state of Pennsylvania, so a good Quaker by all accounts. So moving on, of course, the reality was that the Irish are a pretty resilient lot, and the solution that many found was to continue their schooling, classical wherever possible, in what became known as the hedge schools. In reality, they were barns, they were people's houses, they were outhouses. This is a beautiful play, a scene from a beautiful play by Brian Friel. If any of you haven't come across it, it's called Translations. It's a magnificent play that captures, it's all set in this hedge school. And in this hedge school, the students are learning, well, they're speaking Gaelic and writing Gaelic, but they're also speaking and writing Latin and Greek, quoting from Homer, learning, reading the Iliad. And it's this kind of immersive classical environment that they take for granted. In the midst of that, you can see the red coats on the right of the scene. The British Army are tasked with anglicizing the place names of Ireland by changing the Gaelic names into their English form. So Ballybeog, which is the name of the village where the play is set, becomes Ballybeg. And this is how we get all of the modern place names that Ireland has now, which sound quasi-English. But that was a commission of the British Army that did that work. And of course, the soldiers are greatly amused and look down on the ignorant peasants who don't speak English. But of course, the ignorant peasants are classical Latin and Greek scholars who are sneering at the soldiers. And you see this sort of conflict in the play, which is beautifully captured by Friel between the old world, if you like, and the new modern vision of education. Not everyone went to the hedge schools. Those who could left. One of the people who left was this lady. This is Anastasia Nagel, but everybody where I grew up call her Nano Nagel. So Nano Nagel was educated in France and came under, well, at least was very much influenced by the work of Jean-Baptiste de la Salle, Saint Jean-Baptiste de la Salle, who had founded many schools in France for the education of young boys who could not afford to go to school. She came back to Ireland and decided to do the same thing in Cork City. She opened her first school. This is the middle of the penal laws, completely illegal, in the slums of Cork City, and began teaching young girls who would otherwise have not received any formal education how to read, how to write, and how to actually begin to engage in the education process using the learnings she had encountered from France. That became ultimately the presentation order. And before the eras of globalization, this is what you call a global empire. The presentation sisters were largely responsible for bringing Catholic education to places like Newfoundland, to British India, to Australia, to New Zealand, and continue to this day to a certain extent, although their vocations have dwindled significantly. Following on from Nano Nagel, a whole generation of Irish educators began to follow her lead, and others. So Edmund Rice, I've noted here on the left, is founder of the Christian Brothers, Presentation Brothers, and Mary Aikenhead, another woman from Cork, founder of the Religious Sisters of Charity. So Ireland, all of a sudden, became this epicenter of global, what we would now call classical Catholic education. And these priests and sisters and monks began spreading this vision of Catholic education all over the world. And that had a tremendous impact, as many of you will know, on the Catholic education structures here in the United States in particular. And there's a wonderful book called Catholics in America. If you haven't read it, you need to read it, because that's where you folks are. So it captures the history of how that actually happened. And it's beautiful to see. But the winds were blowing and the winds were changing in terms of education. So I mentioned John Dewey in particular, because his influence, not just here in the US, but right across the Western Hemisphere in terms of education, was tremendous. He died in 1952, but in reality, his ideas only began to promulgate through education systems after his death. And his central tenet was that education systems are a societal interchange between authority and the child, and they are an opportunity, if this is my words, effectively trying to capture the philosophy of Dewey, but they are an opportunity to enact change in society, and that is a change for whatever direction the government or the authorities may wish to move in. The catchphrase, if you like, that modern educationalists use is child-centered learning. So that might sound wonderful. In fact, it does sound wonderful in a sense. But bear in mind that Catholic education for centuries previous had as its center point, guess who? Well, God is the center of Catholic education, not me, even though I might think I'm the center of the universe. In Catholic theology, and particularly in anthropology, we have a place in the universe. I am part of the body of Christ, but I am not the center of the universe. And this was, I suppose, a subtle distinction that was lost on many people as they began to deliver this philosophy into education. 1960s, the picture on the right is the government ministers taking their oath of office from President De Valera. It was a reforming government. It was a time of change in Ireland. The man on the far left is Donna O'Malley. He was a reforming minister for education in Ireland who decided that what we needed was to teach skills in our schools. We needed to train people to work, because all this Greek and Latin is all well and good, but we are not going to generate economic growth if we are not able to, be able to do practical things. And those practical things led to the development of technical schools, vocational schools, boys being taught clerical skills, secretarial skills, girls being taught how to dressmake, how to do all sorts of things that would ultimately add economic value to the economy, not necessarily educate people for life. And we'll come back to that idea. Now, it has to be said, I'm an engineer, and engineers are very pragmatic. There were economic benefits to that approach. This is the European headquarters of Apple. It's 20 minutes from where I live. It employs over 2,000 people. And the Irish government, over a period of 50 years, has been extraordinarily successful in attracting particularly US foreign direct investment into the country. And one of the principal reasons why they've been able to do that is they could point to the education system and say, look here, our graduates are trained to work for you. And that means that they will follow orders, they'll be super compliant, they will do whatever it takes to increase productivity and to move your company forward. And this, coupled with a very, imaginative tax regime, was the reason that we have 950 US companies now have a presence in Ireland. It's number one in the world in terms of US overseas investment. So one might say, well, that's a fantastic outcome, right? Isn't that a wonderful outcome for a small country which needed to diversify in terms of its economic position? So there has been a profound consequence. There has been a cost to that in terms of education, specifically in terms of Catholic education. So my uncle was a Christian brother. He passed away, a De La Salle brother, I beg your pardon. And he would have begun his vocation teaching in a classroom just like this. This is a De La Salle classroom in Dublin. And I suppose the reality was that when the Irish state was founded in 1921, the Irish government was not in a position to provide education for its citizens, and the Catholic Church essentially stepped in to take the role of the church, to take the role of the state, and to provide that education to boys and girls. And they did that essentially working for free for the state. So what the modern state that now, with all of this foreign direct investment, which became wealthy and self-sufficient, and one would think capable of financing its own education system, what they inherited was the education system of the Christian Brothers, the Mercy Sisters, the Presentation Sisters. And so we have this extraordinarily unique position where separation of church and state exists in theory, but the state has inherited all of these schools which historically had a Catholic ethos, and therein lies a fundamental conflict of interest, you might say. The next thing that happened, of course, going back to Frank McCourt's movie, was the uncovering of decades of sexual abuse, but more troubling in a long-term view was the cover-up that went on of the abuse for long periods of that time. And this requires another evening and another talk and another expert to delve into, and I'm just pointing out that this was the watershed moment for Catholic education in Ireland, because I could put up lots of different statistics as a result, but this is, for example, the number of seminarians in the National Pontifical University in Maynooth. We have 20 young men today studying for the priesthood on the island of Ireland. There are 26 dioceses, just to let you know. We don't even have one seminarian per diocese at this point. So the number of people attending Mass is currently somewhere between 25-27%. COVID had an enormous impact on the number of, sorry, this is the number of Catholics attending Mass. So COVID had a tremendously negative impact on Mass attendance, as I'm sure it did over here as well. This is the reality of the church today in Ireland. It's a much weakened place, and we saw the culmination of this in the 2018 vote, which constitutionally removed the right to life of the unborn. There was a specific clause called an amendment to the Constitution called the Eighth Amendment, which protected the life of the unborn child in our Constitution. That was removed by a 2/3 majority. And as the Archbishop of Dublin pointed out on the morning after the vote, 90% of the people who voted for the change, for the removal of that amendment, had attended Catholic schools in Ireland. And that in itself captures the problem that we face. No sooner had the dust settled on the abortion referendum. This is 2 weeks later, the headline in the New York Times. It's all about the schools. The schools became the battleground for all of these cultural agendas and ideologies because, as Dewey taught, if you want to enact change in a society, you need to change how people are educated. So how are people educated? I mentioned that historically, many of these schools retain a Catholic ethos. So roughly 50% of them, in fact, the blue portion here retain a Catholic ethos. The remainder are entirely state-controlled. The descendants, if you like, of those technical and vocational schools. Private education in Ireland is a tiny sliver. When I say private, I mean independently funded of the state government. It doesn't even register on the national scale. There are, a handful of high-end elitist schools in Dublin that cater for international students, children of ambassadors, and so forth. They don't really register in the national system. So there are no independent schools that operate outside of government authority. And the government controls everything in this pie chart. That means the hiring of teachers. Teachers are paid by the government. The curriculum is defined by the government. Examinations are set and assessed by the government. So everything happens within the umbrella, if you like, of the Department of Education. And I suppose one of the realizations that I had when we moved back to Ireland in 2010, I had been brought up, my uncle was a teacher, my dad was a teacher, my brother became a teacher, and it sort of broke my heart to realize that Catholic education, which I had thought growing up was one of the greatest education systems in the world because it was Catholic and it was excellent, well, it certainly wasn't Catholic anymore, or at least we weren't teaching people how to be Catholic anymore. And it certainly wasn't excellent anymore. And I realized that at first hand when I began teaching at third level and began to see the students that were actually coming through our system. I mean, this is a report done on some of the PISA results. PISA is an international study that looks at countries' standardized results across multiple countries. And this is a commentary report on our last PISA scores. Basically, 1 in 5 coming out of the schools can't read, can't write, can't speak, and can't listen, which isn't a great advertisement for the public school system. Only last March, the head of the Irish Mathematics Teachers Association pointed out that they can't do algebra and that they're not prepared for the exit exam, which is called the Leaving Certificate. We are an education system that is in crisis. This has been pointed out by lots of other people, but it's worth being upfront putting our hands up and saying that. That has coincided, of course, with lots of other things that are beginning to appear in our schools. And these ideologies, these ideas, if you like, have been prevalent, have been in the media, have been causing some waves. Parents right now are only beginning to realize the implications of what is happening in our schools. This is happening in Catholic schools, right? This story from the school in Derry, that's a Catholic school, a very well-known Catholic school. So this is something that is affecting young people today in Catholic, so-called Catholic schools in Ireland. I think you can appreciate why Grace and I were concerned enough to look at alternatives. So we began in 2017. Coffee Room Conversations became a working group that in the end became our first board of trustees. And we opened Mater Dei Academy in 2020 with 12 students, got a beautiful reception from our neoliberal media. And we were very blessed, however, to be welcomed by the Dominican community in Cork, whose building is in the picture here. And they've been extremely supportive from the very, very beginning. We founded the school based on 4 pillars. Okay. The first thing is that education is not a means to an end in itself. Catholic education has one goal and one goal only, which is to bring the student to a meeting with Jesus Christ. And if we can't talk about that, if we can't say that Jesus Christ is the center of everything that happens in this school, then we have failed. I don't care what the test scores are. I don't care what college they graduate to. But if we cannot put Jesus Christ into the classroom and be very clear that that is the reason why the school exists, then we will have failed. So every day, we begin the school day with the students singing the morning prayer of the church, just like the monks would have done 1600 years ago, because we need to enter into every day thanking God. It's raining. Thanks be to God. I have a test today. Thanks be to God. I have mathematics first. Thanks be to God. So that we bring this mentality into the classroom, into the school, that my life has been mapped out by God for me, and that what will make me happy is not to do my will, but it's to do God's will. And if I can discover that when I'm 13 years, 14 years old, can you imagine how much easier your life would be? Well, I can imagine how much easier my life would have been. Because this is really what matters for young people today. Not that they ace exams. And, I'm sure some of our students will do fantastically well in exams. But to encounter Jesus Christ in their lives and to be able to have a relationship with him, even though they suffer, even though they might have difficulties, that this is really what matters. So obviously, the sacramental life of the school is critical. Celebration of the Eucharist, penitential services every month. We've been blessed with the support of our bishop, and he has been very supportive, and I'll come back to that. And I've also mentioned the Dominican community. This was our retreat this year. We now have 40 students in the school. And not alone the friars who have been in Cork for over 800 years, but we now have the Sisters of St. Cecilia, what many of you will know as the Nashville Sisters, who are supporting the school through teaching and have been a tremendous source of support to us over the last few years. So a life in Christ is the first pillar on which the school is based. That said, we want to strive for academic excellence. Every student needs to look to be the best student that they can possibly be, because that's what God created and intended for them. So this search for truth is something that is fundamental to a classical education. that the end of my education, okay, there are exams. I mean, we do talk about exams in the school. It's just, I suppose, we don't emphasize it, right, as an end. Because the end of education is not skills for work. Education is about training for life. It's preparing you for life, not for work. Our lives are defined by much more than simply our job. So that doesn't just mean in philosophy and theology class, which the students do take. Theology, because you need to be able to actually understand what God wants of you. And philosophy, because you need to respond to that. You're not a robot. We don't want students that are robots. We want them to think. And in order to be able to think, you need to understand what were the hard problems. Because let's be a little bit humble here. The Greeks had figured out most of the hard problems before Christ even appeared on the earth. They just hadn't gotten all the answers yet. So we need to go back and we need to be able to educate children to be able to look for hard problems and to engage with those problems, to be able to understand their history, their heritage, their culture. Music and art are very important in the life of the school. All of the students learn to play music. Music is part of the air you breathe in Ireland. It's so important because it's all wrapped up in the faith. The Irish language, if you want to say hello in Gaelic, you say Dia Chuit, which means God be with you. And the other person responds, Dia is Murachuit, God and Mary be with you. And then if there's three of you, someone else says, Dia Smiris Padraig, God and Mary and St. Patrick be with you. And then the fourth person, okay, you get the picture. So we have this seamlessly integrated into our language and our culture. We just need to scratch it a little bit and go back to, this understanding that the faith is fundamental to who we are and where we've come from. And that's hopefully something that we've been able to do. We spent a long time, 3 years, developing a curriculum because a curriculum essentially didn't exist. We spent that time looking at schools. Particularly, we took 3 model schools, 2 here in the US, 1 in France, and we used those as sort of prototypes that we could learn from. But we then had to develop something which was uniquely applicable to the Irish student. So in terms of the history, the culture, and so on, it's really important that the students have a sense of place, understand that they have roots, that those roots are deep, and that those roots run in parallel with the church, that the history of Ireland is intertwined. You cannot, as many people are now trying to do, separate one from the other. So, and hopefully that makes for happy students. The third pillar is that we realized from the beginning this is much more than just about our little school in Cork. This is about something that could revitalize Catholic education for the entire country. And, I don't want to exaggerate, but the impact that Ireland has internationally is completely disproportionate to our population, for historical reasons mostly. I mean, I mentioned the Presentation Sisters, but for many, many years, Ireland was the country, the English-speaking country of the Catholic world that people looked to for guidance and for influence over the years. So what we're beginning to see is the fruits elsewhere of what we're doing. There are 2 more schools have opened since we did, following on in our example. This is one of them, a primary school that opened in Limerick last year. There's another, these are elementary schools, mind, that have opened in the past 2 years, and another in Cork last year. The other thing that we've done is, and this is all the genius of my wife, is to launch a homeschool program. And that enables parents at elementary school level in Ireland or anywhere in the world to be able to deliver a classical education to their children and be able to do that with the support of a curriculum, lesson plans. In some cases, we've republished books that haven't been in print for over 40 years. Wonderful history books that actually tell children what really happened in the history of the country. And we're doing that as a means, and we're quite open about this, this is a means for us to support the work of the academy in a financial way, because it underpins what we're doing at second level, while preparing students who may like to come to the academy at second level, who may not come from Cork, for example, so they can homeschool in advance. So national importance is something that we're very clear on. And then the fourth pillar is financial sustainability. So the financial model for the school is radical, shall we say. I mentioned that there are essentially no private schools in Cork, or in Ireland for that matter. And that means that there's no history of paying for Catholic education. That's because the Christian Brothers didn't charge you to go to a Christian Brothers school. So what we've done is we have asked parents to give what they can. And that might sound awfully naive, but we are very conscious that many of the parents who would like their children to come to the school don't have the means to meet the fees that would typically be associated with fee-based education in Ireland. And so we ask them to give what they can. Nobody is penalised as a result, and that funds about 40% of the school's expenses. Another 40% comes from donors, benefactors, people who see that this is really, really important, both here in the US, but mostly in Ireland. And then the remaining 20% comes from a mixture of the homeschool program, and we're now welcoming international students who do pay a fee, which is very modest, but we're finding students from places like France and Spain, very, very elite schools who are Catholic, who are authentically Catholic, and want their children to improve their English, for example. They come to our school for a semester, they have a completely immersive experience, and they have a wonderful reinforcing of the Catholic faith, hopefully, in their lives by the time that they spend in Ireland. So they're the four pillars on which the school is based. I mention Eucharistic processions because I heard you had a wonderful Eucharistic procession here in Washington, and it's a tradition that is very important to us in Cork because it's 97 years since the first Eucharistic procession in Cork. There was a time when the entire Southern Brigade of the Irish Army would serve as a guard of honour for the real presence at the Eucharistic procession. This year was the largest procession in 25 years in Cork. There were 4,000 people, and our students were asked by Bishop Gavin to be the flag bearers at the front of the procession. That's something we're incredibly proud of after 3 years of the school's existence. There are green shoots. There's always hope. And we're beginning to see the fruits of our labours, thanks be to God. I just come back to where I started. So that old derelict looking dingy building that featured in Angela's Ashes, well, that's now the new home, thanks to the generosity of the bishop, for Mater Dei Academy. So last September, because we had run out of space in the old novitiate building in the Dominican Centre, the bishop invited us to move to what's known in Cork as Farn Ferris, this beautiful building here constructed in the late 1800s. As a school, it's designed to be a school, and thanks be to God, for the first time in 15 years, secondary school students are now receiving an education inside its walls. So there is hope, there's always hope. There's probably somebody here who's crunching numbers. These are our KPIs for the next 3 years. We want to grow to 100 students, so 10% growth in international students, and we're moving to a full-time teacher base from a voluntary base. How can people help? And I'll close with this. So first of all, please pray for us. This school would not exist if God didn't exist, if Our Lady hadn't interceded for us. And we've commended it to Our Lady of Knock. There's a beautiful novena that you might like to join us with from the 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption. The novena to Our Lady of Knock begins. And we pray that especially for the intentions of our donors and for those who support the school and for the growth of the school in the future. Second, we are delighted to welcome teachers from the US, particularly teachers who may be classically trained or educated to come to Ireland for a year and to teach in our school. We've done that last year and we're doing it again this year. And that enables us to be able to learn from the experience of some of these wonderful liberal arts colleges over here, and to take that experience. Remember, it was a lot of the Irish priests and nuns that brought education over in this direction a century ago. This is a time for young Catholic Americans to be able to give back in some small way, hopefully, to the church in Ireland through education. And thirdly, that type of exchange is enabled through a 501c3 organization here in the US called the Saints and Scholars Foundation. The Saints and Scholars Foundation enables US donors to be able to support the work that we're doing in a tax efficient way. So with that, I'd like to finish. Wish you all a very happy 4th. And please don't forget to keep us in your prayers. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah, lady in the front here.
You said you used some US schools for prototypes. Which schools were those?
Yeah, so we took St. Jerome's in Hyattsville. We took the Chesterton Academy, the Chesterton Network, I suppose, curriculum, and then we took the Chevagny International School in France as our 3 prototypes. And I'm not saying, there were elements of learnings from that, but we had to create something really from nothing. But they were the 3 we took. And we had long conversations with some of the people involved in those schools. And we also had a lot of input from the Nashville sisters in that regard. So it was a listening process, and it was important for us to listen and learn from those experiences. Yeah, sorry, beg your pardon. Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead. And then we'll move on to this gentleman. Yeah.
Oh, it's just you. Do the students sleep there?
No.
International students, what do they do?
So international students are housed with host families, and those host families are usually connected with the school in some way, and they give the best possible experience to the students, and are constantly in contact with the families. So in a sense, it's almost a better experience than being in a boarding school, because they're immersed in a family environment for the time that they're there, and I think that really encourages. We have more international students who want to come to the school than we have host families to host them right now. So that's the reality of the demand that's out there, because there are lots of schools like ours in places like France and Spain who are probably 20 to 25 years ahead of Ireland in terms of classical education. Yep.
Thank you for an awesome presentation, for everything you do. It's super awesome. But I was just kind of wondering, and this is just kind of like a trend that I see within the church about the lay people really being the drivers behind a lot of revival. And you talked a little bit about the involvement of the local, like ecclesial authorities in the church. But I was just wondering, like, how you could see this helping rehabilitate the Irish church, and like particularly the local one here in Cork, but also just like more broadly the church in Ireland.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. Ireland has a very unusual model of education, as I've tried to explain. There's a lot of complexity there, but I've tried to unpack it as best I could in the short time that we have. If you look to a European model which has a more developed, shall we say, separation of church and state, take France as an example. The UK is not an example for obvious reasons, because King Charles is the head of the church and so on. So France has a 3-part education system. So you have the public schools, which are state funded, and everything happens in those schools is funded and controlled by the government. You have what they call the écoles sous contrat, which are a sort of a semi-analogous to what we have currently in Ireland. Many historically Catholic schools funded in part by the government, in part by Catholic trusts and so forth, that would have been legacies of orders like the Lasallians and others. But they also have a third category that we don't have in Ireland, and you have here very much in the US, which are independent schools, what the French call les écoles hors contrat, out of contract, if you like. And these have no financial relationship with the French state. They have basic requirements around safeguarding, the same as we would have, but no control in the sense that financially they're independent of state control. I think that's probably the model that, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd be telling the Irish Bishops' Conference we should probably be looking to in the long term. But as you can imagine, a lot of these complexities come down to local realities. And I'll give you an example of that. So the Irish government has made a decision that they want to divest large numbers of Catholic schools and make them essentially non-denominational or multi-denominational schools. And in a sense, the bishops are okay with that if that's what the parents want. But the irony is, because there's this deep-rooted cultural Catholicism, so while 2/3 of the population will vote for abortion, they still want their kids in a Catholic school because everyone knows that Catholic education is synonymous with excellence. So, and it's also tied up at elementary school level because the sacraments in some instances are still delivered in the schools. So there's such complexity involved that the bishops are really in a very difficult position, and I would never criticize them for the decisions they're making. They're doing the best they can in a very, very complex situation because they're dealing with people who are not church going in many cases, but still want their kids in these schools that are nominally Catholic for cultural and historical reasons. So there's a lot of complexity there, and I'm not really giving you a straight answer, but it's a difficult, difficult situation. Yeah.
Me again?
I think so. Until Mary pulls down the curtain there.
So, do you have any non-Catholics that want to come to the school?
So, no, we don't. Our admissions policy is very clear. The school exists to support the parents who are the primary educators of the child in the faith. And that's the constitutional position, that the parents are the primary educators. That's not the school's position. And when a parent sends their child to our school, it's because they want that child to be in a completely, authentically Catholic environment, which is delivering faith-based education and not value-based education, which is what a lot of the Catholic, so-called Catholic schools are effectively doing at present. So that's our position. If in the future parents believe that, the evangelization of the society perhaps is better served in other ways, I know that, there are lots of schools of thought on this, then, we're open to that. But right now the position is that if you come to the school, your family is practicing, and that the faith is something that doesn't stop when you walk out of those school gates at 3:00 in the afternoon.
How do you act like in an ever more secularized educational world that also pushes the technology, right? All the kids have to have computers, they have to have the newest computer, they have to have computer lab 4 times a week, they have to do all of the things like that, right?
Yeah.
How do you kind of counteract that with inculcating kind of an appreciation for classicism and an actual search for the truth?
Right.
Now we kind of want everything to be served to you in a way instead of
Correct. Yeah. And anyway, ChatGPT can do
Yeah.
my exams for me, so I don't need to study anymore, right? So it's a really, really pointed question because, and sorry to delve into MIT world for a minute, but MIT Technology Review, we get MIT Technology Review as grads. They ran a special education edition last year, and it got picked up by a lot of other media outlets. But the reality is that the data is now pointing to the use of technology in the classroom as being an overall negative for the child. And study after study after study, you go to China and you discover what technology in the classroom does to young people. So I think we need to wake up in the Western Hemisphere, frankly, and realize there is no substitute for a charismatic, wonderfully engaging teacher who is a person, not a screen, not a piece of software, not an algorithm, but a person. Because to teach is to encounter a person. To learn, rather, is to encounter a person. That person is a teacher who in turn learns something. So we teach in order that the students may learn so that they may teach. And, you know, it might sound funny for an MIT grad to say, I don't see technology as the solution. We certainly use technology where we need to, but we don't have laptops in the classroom. The students have their cell phones left in a locker for the school day. There's no cell phone use in the school at any time. We have a very clear policy on social media, on the students' use of social media in relation to the school. So not because we want to be sort of, you know, the bad cops that are anti-tech because we're ultra-Catholic, but because it's better for the child, it's better for the students. And we ultimately, as the school at least, is ultimately trying to do what's best for the child. Okay, I think we're done, Mary. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.